Hi, I'm Mina.
And I'm Yules.
Thanks for tuning in to Artificially Informed.
You know, when we think about the rules of reality, we tend to assume there is this solid bedrock, like a foundation. You know, you drop an apple, it falls. You look at a clock, time moves forward. Or you look at a map, and the continents are exactly where they're supposed to be. We really rely on that stability just to navigate our daily lives.
Yeah, we take it completely for granted.
Exactly. But what happens when you wake up one day and realize the bedrock isn't solid stone at all? What if it's more like sand or even water? Because today, for this deep dive, we are looking at a diagnostic landscape of reality itself that is suddenly, honestly, incredibly fluid.
It is the absolute definition of paradigm shifting. I mean, we are seeing the rules rewritten across almost every domain of human knowledge right now.
Oh, completely.
From the fundamental laws of physics all the way down to the geopolitical borders that define our maps.
And that is exactly our mission for you today. Today is April 17th, 2026, and we are looking at this massive stack of reporting from global news outlets. It literally bridges the edge of the universe with the bottom of the North Sea.
It's quite a stack.
Yeah, it really is. And it connects the artificial intelligence revolution to the shifting sands of global conflict. We are not just going to run through headlines here. We are going to dissect the machinery underneath all of this to figure out how these forces are actively shaping your life.
Which is so important right now.
So let's jump right into the deep end, the cosmos, specifically black holes. Because my mind is completely blown by this new research.
The love numbers study, yes.
Yes. For decades, classical physics, specifically Einstein's theory of general relativity, established that black holes behave in a very rigid, specific way when exposed to outside forces.
That's right. In classical physics, black holes are characterized by these parameters known as love numbers.
Right. And we should clarify, these aren't about romance.
No, not at all emotional. Love numbers are mathematical parameters that quantify how an object deforms when it's subjected to an external tidal field.
Okay, so like how much it squishes.
Exactly, how much it yields. And the long-standing rule, like the unbreakable law of physics, was that for black holes, these love numbers were exactly zero when they were influenced by what physicists call bosonic fields.
Bosonic fields, which includes things like electromagnetic waves, right?
Precisely. Under classical general relativity, if a bosonic field interacts with a black hole, the black hole simply does not yield. It doesn't deform at all. It maintains this perfect mathematical boundary.
Right, and for a long time, the analogy used to describe this was a perfectly rigid, unsquishable sphere, like an unsquishable stress ball.
Yeah, that was the standard way to explain it.
But honestly, that analogy never really helped me understand why it was unsquishable. But I was reading through the recent physics journals, and I found a better way to visualize this classical view.
Oh, I like this one.
Yeah, so imagine the fabric of space-time as this smoothly woven, incredibly taut hammock, and the black hole is a massive, incredibly dense weight sitting in the very center, stretching that hammock down into a deep funnel.
Okay, I am with you.
So if you roll a bowling ball around the edge of that funnel, and that bowling ball represents these bosonic fields, these heavy, predictable waves, well, the shape of the funnel itself doesn't fundamentally change, it just accommodates the extra weight.
That is actually a much better way to conceptualize it, yeah. The geometry of the black hole remains rigid against that specific type of macroscopic interaction. But the new research that just dropped, it completely shatters this assumption.
It does, it's wild.
Physicists have found that when a black hole is perturbed by fermionic fields, the rules change entirely. The love numbers suddenly become non-zero.
And this is where we have to talk about what fermionic fields actually are, because it's the key to the whole mystery here. Fermions are the particles that make up matter, right? Like electrons, quarks, protons.
Yes, the building blocks.
And unlike bosons, which are force carriers like photons and can happily just clump together in the exact same state, fermions obey something called the Pauli exclusion principle.
Right. They absolutely refuse to occupy the same quantum state at the same time.
They need their personal space.
Exactly. They demand their own space. That's the crucial mechanism. The Pauli exclusion principle dictates that fermions must maintain their individuality, for lack of a better term. When you force a massive amount of fermionic matter together, this refusal to overlap creates an immense outward pressure.
Which is called degeneracy pressure, right?
Yes, degeneracy pressure.
Yeah.
It's actually what keeps dead stars, like white dwarfs and neutron stars, from collapsing entirely under their own gravity.
So bringing this back to our hammock analogy, If the bosonic fields are like smooth bowling balls rolling around the funnel, these fermionic fields are more like, I don't know, millions of violently vibrating cell phones.
That's a great visual.
Right, because they have this microscopic, restless energy because they refuse to share space. And when these fermionic fields interact with the extreme gravitational environment of the black hole, that restless quantum-level vibration actually introduces a macroscopic yield or squish to the black hole's geometry.
Yes. The tension of the fabric itself is fundamentally altered.
It actually squishes the unsquishable.
That is exactly what is happening. The black hole is yielding to the quantum mechanics of the fermions. And I have to say, the implications of this are staggering.
How so? I mean, why is this such a big deal for physics?
Well, general relativity is a classical theory. It doesn't account for quantum mechanics at all. For nearly a century, reconciling the macroscopic world of gravity with the microscopic world of quantum physics has been the holy grail of science.
Oh, right. Because they don't play nice together mathematically.
They absolutely do not. But if black holes, which are the ultimate expression of gravity, are actively responding to fermionic fields in a way that generates non-zero love numbers, well, we are witnessing a direct, observable bridge between quantum mechanics and general relativity.
Wow. So this is the bedrock of reality actually shifting.
Exactly. This could be the mathematical foundation for a unified theory of quantum gravity.
Man, it is incredible to think that the ultimate unyielding voids of the universe are actually reacting to the stubbornness of microscopic particles. And speaking of the sheer terrifying reality of black holes, we aren't just doing math on chalkboards anymore. We are actually measuring their raw physical output now.
Yes, the data from Oxford.
Right. There is this groundbreaking new data from a team at the University of Oxford led by Steve Prabhu. They just published the first ever measurements of the instantaneous power and speed of the jets shooting out of Cygnus X-1.
Cygnus X-1 is one of the most famous black holes in astronomy. I mean, it's relatively close in galactic terms, about 7,200 light years away.
Which is close, relatively speaking.
Right. Very relative. And it's in a binary system, so it's constantly siphoning gas off its companion, which is this massive blue supergent star.
And as that gas spirals in, it gets superheated and compressed, and a portion of it gets blasted outward from the magnetic poles of the black hole in these massive jets. The numbers the Oxford team pulled from 18 years of high-resolution radio imaging, they are just difficult to comprehend.
They really test the limits of human imagination.
Yeah. The power of these jets is equivalent to the output of 10,000 suns.
10,000.
Not one sun, 10,000. And the material inside these jets is traveling at roughly 540 million kilometers per hour, which is about half the speed of light.
What's truly remarkable to me is the efficiency of that engine. They determined that these jets are carrying away roughly 10% of the total energy released by the material falling toward the event horizon.
Okay, wow. 10% is a lot of energy.
It's massive. And understand that exact ratio is critical because these jets aren't just light shows out in the dark. They are the actual architects of the universe.
Wait, what do you mean by architects? How do they build things?
Well, when jets of that power and speed slam into the interstellar medium, which is the gas and dust floating between stars, they generate massive shock waves. They stir up the entire galactic environment.
Oh, I see.
This process is known as cosmic feedback. It can actually heat up cold gas clouds, which prevents them from collapsing and forming new stars. Or, conversely, it can compress gas enough to trigger massive bursts of star formation.
So it's like a galactic thermostat and a mixing spoon all at once?
Exactly. By measuring the exact output of Cygnus X-1, we're looking at the engine that dictates how entire galaxies evolve over billions of years.
That is just wild. But, you know, it's one thing to mathematically redefine the cosmos and measure jets 7,200 light years away, but it's an entirely different reality when you are strapped to a rocket trying to physically survive the environment of space.
Yes, the human element changes everything.
Which brings us to NASA's Artemis II mission. The crew, who are slated to fly around the moon, just gave a major update on their training, and they specifically detailed their Earth re-entry tests.
And re-entry is arguably the most hazardous phase of the entire mission.
Without a doubt.
Artemis II is the first crewed flight of the Space Launch System rocket and the Orion spacecraft. So when Orion returns from the moon, it will hit the Earth's atmosphere at roughly 40,000 kilometers per hour.
Just slamming into the air. And that generates a literal wall of plasma in front of the spacecraft, pushing temperatures up to around 2,760 degrees Celsius.
It's basically a contained meteor.
Yeah. And the crew called the recent heat shield testing intense, which honestly feels like the understatement of the century to me.
Definitely an understatement. They essentially had to verify that the ablative material on the heat shield will burn away at the exact right rate to carry that thermal energy away from the capsule.
Keeping the inside at room temperature while the outside is literal fire.
Exactly. And acing that test in the simulators and material labs is what gives NASA the green light to proceed. But as complex as the plasma physics of reentry are, the success of a deep space mission often comes down to much more, well, immediate human factors.
Yes. Which brings me to my favorite quote of the writ. Artemis II Commander Reed Wiseman spent a good portion of a recent press conference praising the spacecraft's brand new lunar loo.
The lunar loo.
Yeah, he literally described the sanitation system as a wonderful toilet. And if you know anything about the history of space plumbing, from the Apollo bags to the early catastrophic ISS malfunctions, calling a space toilet wonderful is a monumental engineering achievement.
Oh, it really is. We tend to focus on the rocket engines and the telemetry, but human waste management in microgravity is a massive logistical and sanitary hurdle.
It's the unglamorous side of space travel.
Absolutely. If you are going to establish a sustainable human presence on the moon and eventually embark on multi-year missions to Mars, the life support systems, including the plumbing, have to be flawless.
Right.
A failure there isn't just uncomfortable, it's a critical mission hazard due to the potential for bacterial contamination in a completely closed environment.
Right, you can't just open a window. But beyond the hardware and the plumbing, there is an immense emotional weight to Artemis II. The reporting highlighted a really beautiful moment recently. NASA officially named a lunar crater Carol in honor of Commander Wiseman's late wife.
That was incredibly touching.
It really was. The announcement happened in Mission Control, and it was witnessed by his two daughters. Wiseman talked about how deeply moving it was to know that a piece of her memory will permanently reside on the lunar surface, a place he is literally about to fly over.
It grounds this massive, cold, industrial endeavor in genuine human love and memory. Space exploration is so often framed as a geopolitical race, or just a scientific mandate. But fundamentally, it is carried out by fragile human beings who endure profound isolation, danger, and personal sacrifice.
Yeah. The crew also mentioned that through their intense training, they left as friends and came back as best friends.
You absolutely need that.
Oh, for sure. When you are sitting on top of millions of pounds of explosive thrust, relying entirely on the person next to you, that camaraderie is the intangible metric of mission success.
Absolutely. And that necessity for trust and shared rules is extending far beyond the capsule right now. It's happening on the geopolitical stage as well. We just saw Latvia officially sign the Artemis Accords at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, there was a whole ceremony. It included NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman and Latvian Minister of Science Dace Melbard. Latvia actually makes 62 nations that have signed on now.
62 nations is a very solid coalition.
It is. And for those who might not follow space policy closely, the Artemis Accords aren't a binding treaty. They are more of a shared framework of principles for civil space exploration. They cover things like the transparent release of scientific data, rendering emergency assistance to astronauts in distress, regardless of nationality, and guidelines for extracting space resources.
It is an essential diplomatic effort. As the barrier to entry for space drops and more nations and private corporations plan missions to the Moon and Mars, the risk of conflict is very real. Over orbital slots, lunar landing sites, or resource extraction.
Right.
The Accords are an attempt to establish international norms before outer space devolves into a lawless frontier.
A lawless frontier, yeah. That's exactly what we want to avoid. And while the Artemis program is focused on putting boots back on the dust of our own moon, we have other instruments looking much further out, searching for the very origins of the water that makes life possible.
The Sphere X Observatory.
Yes. NASA's Sphere X Observatory is currently mapping interstellar ice across the Milky Way. And they are specifically zeroing in on the Cygnus X star-forming region.
Sphere X is a fascinating observatory because it conducts near-infrared spectroscopy across the entire sky. It's looking for specific chemical signatures.
And in this case, it's mapping the distribution of water ice, which shows up in their data as bright blue, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which show up as orange.
Right, PAHs.
Now, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, we hear that term a lot in environmental science down on Earth, usually in the context of pollution or burning fossil fuels. They are basically rings of carbon atoms. But in deep space, they serve a completely different, miraculous purpose. I was digging into the chemistry of this, and PAHs are essentially the scaffolding for life.
That's a great way to put it, scaffolding. When you are in the freezing, irradiated vacuum of interstellar space, complex chemistry is very difficult. But these PAH molecules, these carbon rings, form naturally in the outflows of dying stars. They float into these massive, freezing molecular clouds.
And this is where the mechanism gets amazing to me. These carbon rings get coated in water ice. And that ice acts like a microscopic protective blanket.
Yes.
It shields the delicate carbon structures from being blasted apart by ultraviolet radiation from nearby stars. Furthermore, the surface of that ice acts like a workbench. Other atoms stick to it, they react with the PAHs, and they start building more complex organic molecules. Amino acids, the literal building blocks of RNA and DNA.
Exactly. So the observatory isn't just looking at random space slush. It is mapping the active chemical factories of the galaxy.
Chemical factories, I love that.
Right. Because when a cloud of gas and dust eventually collapses to form a new star in a solar system, these ice-coated, organically rich grains clump together to form comets and asteroids.
Which then crash into newly formed planets, delivering the starter kit for life. The water we drink, the carbon in our DNA, it was all likely forged on the surface of a microscopic ice grain in a nebula millions of years before the Earth even existed.
It completely connects our profound local existence to the vast, seemingly empty stretches of the galaxy. And we are actually seeing evidence of this delivery system in action.
Oh, with the comet.
Yes, the interstellar comet 3I-ALS, which was discovered traversing our solar system. It underwent a startling transformation as it passed the sun last fall. As it heated up, astronomers observed rapid shifts in its brightness and outgassing. This provided real-time data on how these ancient, icy bodies behave when exposed to stellar radiation.
Just a real-time show of ancient chemistry. And to capture more of this detail, there is a massive push happening right now in Washington. Astronomers are aggressively lobbying Congress for the funding to complete the Giant Magellan Telescope, the GMT, down in the Atacama Desert in Chile.
The GMT is a next-generation ground-based observatory. It utilizes 7 massive 8.4-meter mirrors arranged together.
Which is huge.
Very huge. It gives it a resolving power 10 times greater than the Hubble Space Telescope.
And the pitch to Congress is that this telescope isn't just for taking pretty pictures of nebulas. With that kind of resolution, the GMT will be able to look directly at exoplanets, which are planets orbiting other stars, and dissect the light passing through their atmospheres.
Right. Atmospheric spectroscopy.
We are talking about the ability to definitively detect biosignatures, like the simultaneous presence of oxygen and methane, which would strongly indicate biological processes.
It moves the science from finding planets that could support life to actually observing the chemical respiration of alien ecosystems. But observatory funding takes years to secure and build. In the meantime, I am continually impressed by how everyday people are contributing to this level of astrophysics.
Yes, the citizen science aspect. We have to talk about the HARC project. It stands for Heliophysics Audified Resonances in Plasmas. This is such a brilliant concept. Scientists took decades of ultra-low frequency magnetic field data, basically the invisible waves rippling through Earth's magnetic shield as it gets battered by the solar wind, and they converted that data into audible sound files.
It's a technique called sonification. And they handed these sound files over to a massive network of volunteers to simply listen to them.
And the volunteers found something the algorithmic models completely missed. The theoretical models predicted that the frequency of these magnetic waves would be higher the closer you get to Earth, where the magnetic field is strongest. But the human volunteers, just by listening for anomalies, discovered the exact opposite.
They found lower pitches near Earth and higher pitches further out in the magnetosphere.
Yeah. It's a powerful reminder of the limitations of our current algorithms. A human brain is a highly evolved pattern recognition engine, especially when it comes to audio. We evolved to pick out a predator's rustle in a chaotic forest.
Right, our survival depended on it.
Exactly. And applying that auditory processing to geomagnetic storm data revealed a fundamental misunderstanding in our models of space weather, which, honestly, is critical for protecting our satellite infrastructure.
It just goes to show that while we are building artificial intelligence to map the stars, there is still immense value in the wetware inside our own skulls.
The wetware, yes. And honestly, that transition brings us perfectly into our second major section, life, death, and time travel.
A fascinating combination.
Because if we are going to travel the vast distances to those exoplanets the GMT is looking for, our human wetware has a major expiration date. We have to figure out how to manipulate our own biology.
We are talking about biological time travel, altering the metabolic clock.
Right. And there is a groundbreaking study in the latest medical journals regarding cryosleep. A team of researchers successfully froze a complete mouse brain to negative 196 degrees Celsius, held it there, and then successfully thawed and revived its neural activity with zero structural damage.
To understand why this is such a monumental breakthrough, we have to look at the cellular mechanics of freezing tissue. The human body and a mouse body is mostly water.
Right.
When water freezes, it forms ice crystals. At a microscopic level, these ice crystals are incredibly sharp, jagged structures.
Like little microscopic knives.
Exactly like knives. If you simply freeze a brain, those ice crystals puncture the delicate membranes of the neurons, utterly destroying the neural architecture and the synaptic connections.
It basically turns the brain into mush on a cellular level. So how did they bypass this? Because negative 196 degrees is very frozen.
They bypassed it through a highly advanced process of vitrification. They didn't just freeze the water, they replaced the blood and fluids in the mouse brain with a proprietary mix of cryoprotecting chemicals.
Like biological antifreeze.
Yes. These chemicals interact with the water molecules, preventing them from forming a crystalline lattice. Instead, as the temperature drops to negative 196 degrees, the fluid transitions into a smooth, glass-like state. Everything is suspended in this amorphous solid without a single cell membrane being pierced.
Wow. And when they carefully reverse the process, warming the tissue and flushing out the cryoprotectants, the neural pathways fired right back up.
Yes, functional recovery.
The implications for space travel here are massive. A multi-year journey to Mars or a multi-decade journey to the outer solar system requires thousands of pounds of food, water, and life support systems per astronaut. But if you can induce a state of deep hibernation or cryosleep, you reduce those metabolic demands to near zero.
And there is a secondary, perhaps even more vital benefit to hibernation. Extensive biological studies on hibernating mammals here on Earth show that deeply depressed metabolic states naturally induce a high level of radioresistance.
Meaning resistance to radiation.
Yes.
Because out in deep space, beyond the protection of Earth's magnetic field, cosmic rays, these high-energy particles zooming through space, are constantly bombarding the astronauts. They literally shred DNA, leading to severe cancer risks.
Exactly. When a cell is highly active, dividing and metabolizing, its DNA is unspooled and very vulnerable to being snapped by a cosmic ray.
Like an open target.
Yes. But during hibernation, cellular activity halts. The DNA is tightly coiled and protected. Furthermore, when the body does eventually wake up, the cellular repair mechanisms seem to go into overdrive, fixing whatever low-level damage did occur. Mastering this could actually be the only viable way to survive the radiation environment of deep space.
Okay, so vitrifying a brain for a Mars trip is one approach. But nature already has a creature that has mastered biological time travel without needing a freezer at all. We have to talk about the warty comb jelly.
Ah, yes. Nemiopsis ledi.
That's the one, officially known as Nemiopsis ledi. This little translucent marine organism is completely rewriting what biologists thought was possible.
It is joining the very small, very exclusive club of organisms capable of reverse aging.
Right. When the comb jelly is put under extreme life-threatening stress, like prolonged starvation or severe physical injury, it doesn't just try to heal the damage. It actively reverses its developmental clock.
It transforms from a fully mature, low-bait adult, complete with complex structures for hunting, all the way back into a simple, microscopic, ciliated larval state.
It just hits reverse.
The scientific term for this is reverse morphogenesis. It is a complete reorganization of its body plan. To survive the environmental stressor, it drastically reduces its metabolic demands by shedding its adult complexity. It hits the reset button on its cellular identity.
Now, I have to stop and ask the obvious question here because I saw the headlines and they're all screaming about the quote-unquote key to immortality. Is mapping this jellyfish genome actually a viable pathway to human immortality? Or are we just marveling at a really neat survival trick for a very simple organism? Because, I mean, a human being is infinitely more complex than a comb jelly. We can't just shrink back into a fetus if we miss a few meals.
I know. We certainly cannot shrink back into a fetus.
Yeah.
The structural complexity of a human cardiovascular and nervous system completely prohibits macroscopic reverse morphogenesis. However, the headlines aren't entirely wrong to be excited. Right. The goal isn't to turn a human back into a baby. The goal is to understand the genetic switches the comb jelly is flipping at the cellular level. Aging in humans is largely driven by cellular senescence.
Which means cells getting old and stopping.
Yes. Cells lose their specific identity over time, they stop dividing, and they just sit there, emitting inflammatory signals that degrade the surrounding tissue.
They become zombie cells.
Exactly, zombie cells. But the comb jelly has a mechanism to tell a specialized adult cell to revert back to a flexible stem cell-like state. If we can map the specific proteins and genetic pathways that allow for that cellular reprogramming, we can look for analogous dormant pathways in the human genome. It's about finding the chemical commands to tell our own tissues to regenerate rather than decay.
And scientists are already zeroing in on those commands from other angles too, right? A major study just dropped detailing the discovery of a specific quote-unquote death protein in mammalian models, and it seems to act as a master switch for the aging process.
Yes, this is a huge development. As the organism ages, the expression of this protein spikes, and it actively shortens telomeres, which are the protective caps on the ends of DNA strands.
Like the plastic tips on shoelaces.
Perfect analogy. And when those get shortened, it accelerates that cellular senescence we just talked about.
And by utilizing targeted therapies to inhibit the production of that specific protein, the researchers observed a drastic slowing of age-related tissue degradation in the animal models.
It's remarkable.
So between mastering cryopreservation, understanding the reverse morphogenesis of the comb jelly, and targeting these master switch aging proteins, the biomedical field is fundamentally shifting its paradigm. Aging is no longer viewed as an inevitable universal law of physics. It's being approached as a systemic disease, a highly complex engineering problem that can potentially be managed, slowed, or even reversed at the cellular level.
It is a deeply intoxicating thought.
It really is.
But while we are looking to the future trying to cheat death, researchers are simultaneously digging deep into the past to understand how complex life survives massive, catastrophic changes.
Which brings us to a fascinating piece of archaeological resurrection. Deep beneath the freezing waters of the North Sea, advanced DNA analysis of seabed sediment cores has revealed the ghost of an entire submerged world known as Doggerland.
Doggerland. It was a massive contiguous land bridge that connected what is now Great Britain to continental Europe.
So you could just walk across.
You could. During the last ice age, when massive amounts of the Earth's water were locked up in glaciers, global sea levels were significantly lower, exposing this vast plain.
And for a long time, the assumption was that Doggerland was just this barren, windswept tundra. But researchers have been driving these massive hollow tubes deep into the seabed, pulling up cores of ancient mud and using environmental DNA sequencing.
Basically looking for microscopic fragments of genetic material left behind by ancient plants and animals.
Right. And what they found is just stunning. 16,000 years ago, Doggerland was incredibly biodiverse. The DNA shows it was covered in lush, sprawling forests of oak, elm, and hazel.
It was a thriving ecosystem, rich with game and vegetation, and it was a primary thoroughfare and settlement area for Mesolithic human populations.
But then the ice started to melt, and the sea levels began to rise. Over thousands of years, this entire paradise was systematically swallowed by the ocean. So the question I had reading this is, why are we spending millions of dollars sequencing ancient mud from a drowned forest? What's the practical application?
Because Doggerland is the ultimate localized case study in extreme climate change and ecological failure.
Oh, I see.
Right. By sequencing the distinct layers of sediment, scientists can track exactly how the flora and fauna responded as the sea levels crept higher. Did certain tree species adapt to the increasing salinity? Did the migration patterns of the fauna shift in predictable ways? How did the human populations manage the shrinking landmass?
It's basically a high-resolution simulation of our own immediate future. As global temperatures rise today and coastal cities face the realities of rising sea levels, the ancient DNA from Doggerland provides empirical data on the limits of ecological resilience. It shows us what adaptation actually looks like. And more importantly, it shows us what the tipping point into complete ecosystem collapse looks like.
Exactly. History, particularly deep history, is the only baseline we have for planetary scale changes.
And speaking of deep history, as we uncover these ancient landscapes, we are also learning some deeply unsettling things about how ancient human cultures operated within them. A massive survey of Bronze Age archaeological sites has revealed a widespread, systematic practice that honestly completely shatters our modern sensibilities.
The bone tools.
Yeah. It turns out that Bronze Age humans routinely utilized the bones of their deceased relatives and community members to craft practical tools and ceremonial items.
Yes. They were finding musical instruments, weaving tools, and decorative ornaments carved directly from human femurs and cranial fragments.
And from a modern perspective, we look at that and immediately think of desecration. Like today, grief is heavily compartmentalized. We separate the dead from the living. We place them in distinct cemeteries or urns. The idea of using a grandfather's bone to weave a basket feels incredibly macabre.
It does to us, yes.
Yeah.
But that reaction is a projection of modern cultural norms. Anthropologists analyzing these finds suggest a completely different psychological framework.
How did they see it?
Well, for these Bronze Age societies, utilizing the bones of ancestors was a profound form of reverence. It was a mechanism for keeping the deceased actively involved in the survival and daily life of the community.
So it reinforced a physical, tangible continuity.
Yes, the ancestor wasn't gone. They were still contributing to the harvest, still participating in the music of a festival. It wove the concept of mortality seamlessly into the fabric of daily existence, creating a powerful social cohesion that actually helped these communities survive harsh environments.
It really reframes our relationship with death, and it shows how incredibly fluid cultural narratives can be. And speaking of fluid narratives, we saw another perfect example of cultural manipulation this week in Egypt. Archaeologists working in the Karnak temple complex in Luxor uncovered a beautifully preserved 2,000-year-old sandstone monument.
The Tiberius Monument.
Right, but the image carved into it is a massive contradiction. It depicts the Roman Emperor Tiberius, but he is dressed head to toe as a traditional Egyptian pharaoh offering sacrifices to Egyptian gods.
This is a textbook, masterful example of geopolitical assimilation. Egypt was arguably the most vital province of the Roman Empire, primarily because it was the breadbasket that fed the entire city of Rome.
Wow.
Maintaining control there was paramount.
So was this just ancient public relations? Like, was Tiberius sitting in a villa in Rome, sending out a decree saying, hey, make sure the locals see me in a headdress so they don't revolt? Or did the Romans actually respect the Egyptian pantheon?
It was a highly calculated duality. The Roman administrative machine was ruthlessly pragmatic. They understood that to govern a civilization as ancient, wealthy, and deeply religious as Egypt, imposing foreign Roman gods and customs from the top down would invite endless rebellion.
They'd just be fighting constantly.
Exactly. So by portraying Tiberius as a pharaoh, the Roman administration provided narrative continuity for the Egyptian populace.
It legitimized his rule through the established lens of Egyptian divine kingship, rather than just raw military occupation.
Yes. To the Roman legion stationed there, Tiberius was the imperator. But to the Egyptian farmers paying the grain tax, he was the living embodiment of Horus, maintaining the cosmic order, or Ma'at. It was brilliant propaganda, but it also reflects the Roman genius for absorbing and utilizing the cultural power of the territories they conquered.
It's all about controlling the narrative to maintain the supply chain. Before we leave the physical artifacts of the past, I do want to briefly touch on this incredible maritime discovery.
The Corsair ship.
Yes. Oceanic researchers conducting a sonar survey off the coast of Morocco accidentally pinged an anomaly. And when they sent down the submersibles, they found the pristine lower hull of a 17th century Barbary Corsair pirate ship resting on the seabed. It's about 45 feet long and heavily armed with cast iron cannons.
The Barbary Corsairs were a dominant, terrifying naval force in the Mediterranean from the 16th well into the 19th centuries. Operating primarily from ports in North Africa, cities like Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, these privateers completely disrupted European maritime trade.
They were a major problem for Europe.
Huge. They captured merchant vessels, confiscated cargoes, and took crews for ransom or sold them into slavery.
Finding a preserved vessel like this is incredibly rare because ships of that era usually break apart in the surf or are eaten by shipworms. But this deep-water wreck gives maritime historians a tangible look at the actual naval engineering of these fleets. Because it wasn't just a ragtag group of outlaws, this was a highly sophisticated, state-sponsored enterprise that required complex logistics, shipwrights, and tactical naval planning to project power across the Mediterranean.
It's a snapshot of an era where power was projected through wood, canvas, and iron.
Which provides a perfect jarring transition into our third section, the algorithmic reality. Because we have moved from the bronze tools of ancient ancestors and the wooden hulls of 17th century pirates to a world driven by invisible tools.
Algorithms and AI.
Yes. We're talking about the technology and artificial intelligence that are fundamentally altering how we consume, how we secure our infrastructure, and how we even perceive the truth. Let's start with the economy, because the architecture of the internet is changing right beneath our feet. Adobe just released a massive analytics report stating that AI-driven traffic to U.S. retail websites is up 393% in the first quarter of 2026. March alone saw a 269% jump.
We really have to clarify what that traffic actually is. These aren't humans typing URLs or clicking links.
Right.
These are AI agents, autonomous shopping bots, and large language models scraping inventory databases, comparing prices in milliseconds, and in many cases, executing purchases on behalf of a human user who simply gave a prompt, like find the best deal on running shoes and buy them.
And Google is aggressively leaning into this. They just launched AI mode on their Chrome desktop browser, which is powered by their Gemini model. It fundamentally changes the user interface. You don't just search and click links anymore. You explore the web side by side with an AI assistant that reads the pages, summarizes reviews, answers complex queries about the product, and tracks local stock in real time.
It is the complete integration of AI into the friction points of commerce. The goal of these tech companies is to entirely remove the traditional search and scroll process and replace it with direct AI curation.
But I was looking at these numbers, the 393% increase in bot traffic, and it immediately made me think of the dead internet theory.
Oh, yes. That's a very relevant theory right now.
Yeah. It's this concept that the human internet is dying, and we are rapidly transitioning into a space where the vast majority of web traffic, content creation, and economic interaction is just AI agents talking to other AI agents. If retail sites are optimizing their layouts and SEO, not for human eyes, but for Google's Gemini to easily read them, humans are being actively cut out of the loop. We are literally designing infrastructure for the machines.
That is a very astute observation. When the primary consumer of digital data becomes an algorithm, the entire incentive structure of the internet shifts. But there is an even deeper psychological layer to this hypercuration, especially when we look at social platforms.
Yes, this ties into a phenomenal piece of behavioral analysis we read this week titled "Everything We Like is a PSYOP."
What a title.
Right. It dives deep into the mechanisms of algorithms, specifically using TikTok as the prime example. The premise is that the recommendation engine is so pervasive, so finely tuned to microbehaviors, like how long you linger on a frame, whether you click the comment section, that it has moved past predicting what you like. It is actively shaping your cultural trends and individual preferences.
It is the weaponization of the dopamine loop. The algorithm isn't a neutral mirror reflecting your interests. It is a behavioral modification engine. It feeds you a precise cocktail of content designed to maximize time on app. And the terrifying part is the blurring of the line between genuine organic human interest and artificial code-driven marketing.
The article raised a question that genuinely kept me up at night. Are your tastes truly your own, or are you being curated by code? If you decide you suddenly love a specific aesthetic or genre of music, did you discover it? Or did an algorithm understand your psychological triggers better than you do and systematically condition you to like it to sell targeted advertising? It feels like a massive loss of digital autonomy.
It is. It absolutely is. And the tech industry knows this, which is why there is a trillion-dollar arms race right now to build the most dominant AI layer. We are seeing incredible consolidation and fierce competition.
Oh, the drama in the tech world.
Yes. For instance, OpenAI just launched a major upgrade to their Codex Mac app. It's now running on GPT 5.3, and they've integrated a feature called Codex Security, which proactively audits and fixes coding vulnerabilities as a developer types.
Right. They are aggressively positioning it as a super app to challenge Anthropic's Claude Code, which has been really dominating the developer space lately. And the corporate drama surrounding this is just wild. At the exact same time OpenAI drops this upgrade, Mike Krieger, the chief product officer at Anthropic, unexpectedly resigns from the board of Figma, the massive design software company, explicitly to build a competing AI-driven design product inside Anthropic.
The industry is calling this the Sixpocalypse. The software as a service apocalypse.
That is dramatic.
It is, but it's accurate. These massive AI labs, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, they realize that whoever controls the ultimate AI assistant controls the entire workflow of the modern knowledge worker. They don't want you using 5 different apps for coding, design, and writing. They want their AI to be the single interface you interact with.
And investors are pouring oceans of capital into this belief that AI is a winner-takes-all market. Look at the startup scene. A company called Slash, founded by a group of 24-year-olds, just raised a $100 million Series B funding round. They are valued at $1.4 billion.
Astonishing numbers.
And what do? They use AI to manage corporate expenses, directly challenging established giants like Ramp. The sheer velocity of the money moving into these tools is staggering.
But as these tools become more powerful and more democratized, the dark side of the equation becomes exponentially more dangerous. The same AI that can optimize a supply chain or write a brilliant piece of code can be weaponized with devastating efficiency.
Which brings us to Europol's recent intervention. They just coordinated a massive multinational sweep called Operation Eastwood. They seized and shut down 53 domains belonging to a notorious pro-Russian hacktivist group known as No Name 05716.
This group has been highly disruptive, running massive distributed denial of service, or DDoS, attacks against critical European infrastructure, banks, transportation grids, government portals.
And a DDoS attack essentially floods a server with so much artificial traffic that it collapses under the load, knocking the service offline.
Exactly. It just overwhelms the system.
But the part of this operation that really caught my eye was Europol's tactic. After shutting down the domains, Europol actively sent emails to 75,000 specific individuals associated with the botnets used in these attacks, explicitly warning them to cease their illicit activities. They didn't just hit the infrastructure, they targeted the individual cogs in the hacktivist machine.
It's a fascinating pivot in cyber law enforcement. It's a digital shot across the bow, letting thousands of low-level participants know that their anonymity is an illusion.
Right. We see you.
It's exactly. However, while Europol is playing whack-a-mole with DDoS botnets, the global financial sector is bracing for a much more sophisticated threat. Top bankers and finance ministers have been sounding the alarm all week in closed-door sessions about a newly identified AI model dubbed Mythos AI.
I was looking at the technical architecture of Mythos AI, and what terrified me wasn't just the complexity of the code itself, it was the complete democratization of the attack vectors. Traditionally, if you wanted to breach a major bank or a power grid, you needed a team of highly skilled hackers with deep technical expertise in network architecture and zero-day vulnerabilities. Mythos AI essentially automates all of that.
It really does. It operates like a highly intelligent, autonomous penetration tester, but without the ethical guardrails. A bad actor with very little coding experience can simply instruct Mythos AI to scan a target's infrastructure, identify vulnerabilities, autonomously write the bespoke malware required to exploit those specific weaknesses, and deploy it.
It's essentially handing out digital lockpicks to anyone with an internet connection. The barrier to entry for devastating cyber warfare has dropped to basically zero.
And that is exactly why the financial sector is terrified. The sheer volume of sophisticated attacks is expected to overwhelm traditional human-led cybersecurity defenses. We are entering an era where AI must be deployed to fight AI at machine speed.
And it's not just infrastructure and banking that are vulnerable to this technology. It is the fundamental nature of truth, especially in conflict zones. This brings us to a deeply concerning story regarding the Israeli military. They recently admitted to utilizing an AI image generator to fabricate a photograph of a Lebanese journalist who was killed in an airstrike.
The intention behind the fabrication was clear. The Israeli military released the AI-generated image portraying the deceased journalist in military gear, aiming to posthumously label him as a militant member of Hezbollah, thereby justifying the strike.
And when independent analysts scrutinized the image, they found the digital artifacts inherent to AI generation. Mismatched lighting, structural anomalies in the background. The Israeli military eventually conceded the image was fabricated. The Foreign Press Association issued a scathing condemnation, and rightfully so. We have to talk about the chilling effect this has on reality. If we cannot trust the photographic evidence provided by state actors, how do we ever understand what is objectively happening on the ground?
In the fog of war, truth is famously the first casualty. But historically, photographic evidence provided at least a baseline metric of reality. The weaponization of generative AI to create photorealistic propaganda completely shatters that baseline. It allows militaries and governments to rapidly construct alternate realities to shield themselves from international accountability.
It's the ultimate distortion algorithm, and enforcing any kind of ethical guideline or international law regarding AI use in a chaotic war zone feels practically impossible.
Which is the true tragedy of the situation. The technology has evolved far faster than our diplomatic and legal frameworks can contain it.
And that stark reality leads us directly into our final section. The geopolitical engine, the digital conflicts, the algorithmic manipulations, and the deep technological shifts we've discussed so far bleed directly into the physical reality of 2026's geopolitics and the global economy. As we navigate this final section, we want to make it clear to you, the listener, that we are going to present the facts of these ongoing conflicts alongside the differing political perspectives fairly and impartially. We aren't taking sides here. Our goal is to dissect the mechanics of how these events are shaping the world.
The global landscape is highly polarized right now, and understanding the complete picture requires examining the underlying logic of multiple viewpoints.
Let's begin with the major diplomatic breakthrough in the Middle East. U.S. President Donald Trump has officially brokered a 10-day ceasefire agreement between Israel and Lebanon. And critically, this agreement includes the confirmed cooperation of the militant group Hezbollah.
The geopolitical leverage required to achieve this was immense. Concurrently with the ceasefire announcement, Iran and the United States confirmed that the Strait of Hormuz, which is the vital maritime choke point between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, is fully open to commercial shipping again after a tense 7-week military blockade.
And the mechanics of that blockade reopening are entirely economic. The global markets reacted instantly. Oil prices fell sharply the moment the tankers started moving again, providing massive relief to a global economy that relies on the strait for roughly 20% of the world's crude oil exports.
That's a huge chunk of global energy.
It is. But while the immediate crisis is paused, the financial devastation left in the wake of the conflict is staggering. Rystad Energy, a leading independent energy research firm, just released a comprehensive damage assessment. They estimate the total repair bill across the region at a monumental $58 billion.
And we really need to break that number down to understand the physical reality of the war. $50 billion of that estimate is concentrated entirely in the energy sector. We are talking about pulverized refineries, severed pipelines, and destroyed export terminals.
The report specifically highlighted that Iran alone is expected to bear roughly $19 billion of those costs, largely due to targeted strikes on critical processing infrastructure. But the most alarming part of the Rystad report isn't the dollar amount, it's the timeline. They noted that simply securing the financing for these repairs isn't the bottleneck.
What's the holdup then?
The real issue is a severe global shortage of specialized engineering equipment and EPC, engineering, procurement, and construction, contractors capable of rebuilding highly complex petrochemical facilities. They estimate it will take years to fully bring the region's energy output back to pre-war levels.
That physical reality is exactly why the diplomatic framing of this ceasefire is so intensely debated within the United States.
Right. Let's look at both sides. If we look at this from a right-leaning perspective, the Trump administration and its supporters are heralding the ceasefire and the reopening of the strait as a massive, unequivocal victory for their foreign policy doctrine.
The core argument there is that projecting overwhelming military strength and applying maximum economic pressure are the only effective deterrents. From this viewpoint, the administration's aggressive posturing and willingness to use force directly compelled adversaries like Iran and Hezbollah to back down, forcing them to the negotiating table. The tangible results, the ceasefire, the dropping of global gas prices, and the subsequent record-high rallies we are seeing right now in the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ are presented as proof that the strategy of strength secures American interests and stabilizes the domestic economy.
However, there is fierce systemic pushback against this narrative from the left-leaning perspective. Critics are focusing heavily on the immense human costs and the controversial mechanisms the executive branch used to wage this conflict.
The humanitarian toll cannot be ignored. Reports indicate over 2,000 deaths in Lebanon alone, alongside massive civilian displacement and the destruction of vital municipal infrastructure.
Furthermore, the domestic political battle regarding how this war was executed reached a boiling point in Washington just days ago. The House of Representatives attempted to pass a binding war powers resolution. The explicit goal was to legally limit President Trump's ability to engage in further military action against Iran without prior congressional approval.
And that resolution failed by a margin of just one single vote.
One vote. It highlights the incredible tension between the executive branch's desire for speed and decisive action and Congress's constitutional mandate for oversight. The critics argue that the administration deliberately bypassed the traditional checks and balances of the republic, risking a catastrophic, wider regional war without the consent of the American people via their representatives. From this perspective, the 10-day ceasefire isn't viewed as a lasting diplomatic victory, but rather a temporary, fragile pause in a dangerous, prolonged engagement that has severely isolated the U.S. on the global diplomatic stage.
And regardless of the political framing, the sheer logistical strain of the conflict is becoming apparent. The domestic industrial mobilization required to sustain this level of military engagement is intense. The Pentagon is currently in deep, active negotiations with major U.S. automakers, specifically Ford and General Motors, operating through its GM defense subsidiary.
They are discussing shifting civilian automotive manufacturing lines over to the production of weapons and munitions.
Exactly. The Defense Department stated they are operating on a wartime footing. The U.S. military stockpiles of precision-guided munitions, particularly cruise missiles, have been severely depleted over the last few months. The conflict is burning through hardware at an astonishing rate, costing the U.S. government approximately $2 billion a day. So while the stock market celebrates the drop in oil prices, the underlying strain on the military-industrial base is severe.
And the ripple effects of the conflict in the Middle East go far beyond cruise missiles and the price of gasoline in the U.S. Let's talk about the profound threat to the global food supply. Jose Andres, the founder of the disaster relief organization World Central Kitchen, issued a dire data-backed warning this week. He stated that the U.S.-Israeli conflict with Iran has laid the groundwork for a multi-year global famine.
To understand the mechanics of this, we have to look back at the Strait of Hormuz. It is primarily known for oil, but it is also a vital artery for the global shipment of nitrogen-based fertilizers.
Right. And the 7-week blockade of the strait completely halted those fertilizer shipments. Agriculture operates on strict, unforgiving seasonal timelines. Because the deliveries were delayed, farmers across the globe, from the American Midwest to Southeast Asia, missed their crucial planting windows.
Andres and agricultural economists predict that the resulting drop in crop yields won't be fully felt until the fall harvests of 2026 and well into 2027. This artificially induced scarcity will cause a massive cascading spike in global food prices. A recent UN report modeled this exact scenario, estimating that the resulting inflation could push 32 million people into extreme poverty across 162 countries.
We are already seeing the leading edge of this crisis. Food crises in the Caribbean, where island nations are heavily dependent on maritime imports for basic staples, are soaring. It is a textbook example of how a geopolitical conflict over energy and borders instantly metastasizes into a crisis of fundamental human survival.
And this looming food crisis is colliding head-on with the broader existential challenge of global climate change, which is causing massive political fracturing on the international stage.
The climate policy clash is at an absolute boiling point this week. The World Bank's Climate Change Action Plan, known as the CCP, expires this coming June. The international negotiations to draft a replacement framework have completely disastrously stalled.
This deadlock represents a fundamental disagreement on the core mission of international financial institutions. The Trump administration, with U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent leading the charge, is aggressively pushing for the World Bank to withdraw from strict, binding climate finance targets.
And their argument is rooted in immediate economic pragmatism. Bessent argues that mandating strict investments in green energy actually hinders poverty alleviation in developing nations. The perspective is that these nations need cheap, reliable, high-density energy immediately to build infrastructure, grow their economies, and feed their populations. Therefore, the U.S. is advocating for the World Bank to fund fossil fuel infrastructure, like natural gas plants, in these regions to accelerate economic growth.
On the opposing side, a coalition of European and Latin American nations, supported heavily by global environmental advocacy groups, argue that this approach is dangerously short-sighted.
I was listening to the debate from the European delegates, and their point is that sacrificing long-term planetary survival for short-term economic development is a false choice. They argue that developing nations are the ones who suffer the most immediate and devastating consequences of climate-driven disasters. If you build a natural gas plant to boost the economy today, but the resulting global temperature increase causes a drought that destroys the agricultural sector tomorrow, you haven't alleviated poverty. You've engineered a collapse.
Especially with meteorologists predicting a severe El Niño pattern developing, which threatens to bring massive heat waves and alter rainfall patterns globally. But while the federal governments and international banks remain gridlocked in this ideological battle, we are seeing significant action at the local level. The America is All-In Coalition, which is a massive network of U.S. mayors, governors, and tribal leaders, reaffirmed their commitment this week to meeting the Paris Agreement emissions targets locally, regardless of federal policy shifts.
They are trying to build a patchwork of localized resilience, but undoing ecological damage is incredibly stubborn work. A major environmental report released today focused on the Florida Everglades. Despite a dedicated 40-year restoration effort and billions of dollars in state and federal funding, the report concluded that severe pollution, primarily from agricultural phosphorus runoff, persists throughout the ecosystem. It's a stark reminder that once you break the delicate balance of a massive ecosystem, throwing money at it doesn't guarantee a fix.
It highlights the extreme difficulty of balancing massive agricultural industries with environmental preservation.
Which brings us to the final piece of our geopolitical puzzle today, the moral and diplomatic voices trying to cut through the noise and influence these massive global events.
We saw profound intervention from the Vatican this week.
Yes, Pope Leo XIV. He recently traveled to Cameroon and held the largest mass of his entire papacy, addressing an astonishing crowd of 100,000 youths. And he used that massive platform to deliver a blisteringly sharp critique of global leadership. He explicitly condemned a handful of tyrants who are choosing to spend billions of dollars on sophisticated weaponry in a perpetual war, rather than addressing the immediate, pressing humanitarian issues of famine, poverty, and ecological degradation.
The geopolitical context of the Pope's address is crucial. These statements immediately followed a very public, tense diplomatic spat between the Vatican and President Trump regarding the necessity of military force in the Middle East versus the pursuit of diplomatic peace efforts. The Pope is actively wielding his immense moral authority to challenge the dominant political premise that military strength is the only viable path to security. By speaking directly to the youth in Cameroon, a region grappling with its own complex civil unrest and economic struggles, he is urging the next generation to reject the normalization of violence as a tool of statecraft.
It is a powerful, sobering message. And finally, just a brief note on the political turbulence across the pond. In the UK, Prime Minister Keir Starmer is currently fighting for his political life, facing intense pressure from within his own party and calls for his immediate resignation. The crisis centers around a severe security vetting scandal. It was revealed that former U.S. Ambassador Peter Mandelson was granted high-level security clearance, completely overruling the explicit advice and warnings of the UK's intelligence vetting agencies.
And the reason the agencies flagged him is that Mandelson is currently under active police investigation for allegedly leaking classified documents to the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
10 Downing Street claims that the Prime Minister was entirely unaware that the intelligence agency's recommendations had been overridden by political appointees. However, the revelation has sparked a massive systemic debate within Parliament about transparency, accountability, and the integrity of the highest levels of government appointments.
It's a stark reminder that while we grapple with black holes and artificial intelligence, the basic mechanics of political trust remain incredibly fragile. Well, we have covered an unbelievable, almost overwhelming amount of ground today. As we synthesize all of this, pulling these threads together, I'm just marveling at the sheer scale of the information. We exist in a time where we possess the staggering technological capacity to vitrify mammalian brains for deep space travel, and we can pull a core of mud from the bottom of the freezing ocean and map the DNA of an oak forest that hasn't seen the sun in 16,000 years.
We have instruments mapping the literal chemical scaffolding of life in star-forming regions millions of light years away, and we are measuring the relativistic speeds of black hole jets.
Exactly. We possess this godlike technological and scientific capability, yet despite all of it, we are still fundamentally grappling with the most ancient, primal human struggles. We are still fighting brutal wars over regional borders and energy resources. We are still struggling to ensure that the global population has enough food to survive the winter. And we are desperately trying to hold on to the concept of objective truth in a digital world that is increasingly curated, manipulated, and generated by autonomous AI algorithms. We are walking among the stars, but our feet are still very much stuck in the mud.
It is the great paradox of the human condition in the 21st century. Our technological evolution has vastly outpaced our social, diplomatic, and psychological evolution. Which brings to mind a final thought for you to ponder today as we close out. Earlier, we spent time discussing the warty comb jelly. We learned that when this organism is placed under immense life-threatening environmental stress, it doesn't push forward. It actively reverses its own developmental aging. It undergoes morphogenesis just to survive, transforming from a complex, capable adult back into a much simpler, basic larval state.
Right. It reverts to its most primitive form to weather the storm.
Exactly. So looking at the immense, unprecedented stress our own species is under globally right now, from the existential threat of the climate crisis to regional wars that threaten cascading global famines to the disruptive, reality-bending power of artificial intelligence, we have to look in the mirror and ask ourselves a very difficult question. Are we currently adapting, collaborating, and evolving into a more advanced, complex society to meet these challenges? Or, under the crush of all this stress, are we just slowly reverting to an older, more primitive version of ourselves?
Wow, that's a heavy question to leave on. Are we evolving or are we devolving under the pressure? Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. We've unpacked a massive amount of reality, but the goal is always to help you see the hidden connections between the cosmos, the code, and the conflicts. Keep asking the hard questions, keep challenging the algorithms that feed you, and keep looking beyond the headlines. Until next time, keep your algorithms honest and keep looking up.
For enjoying Artificially Informed.
Hit subscribe and share it with a friend.
From the left, the right, and straight from the algorithm.
Thank you.
Welcome to The Debate. Usually when we think about the global economy, we picture this massive, like a planetary circulatory system.
Right, exactly.
And the prevailing wisdom has always been that it's highly sensitive, right? That if you apply unilateral pressure to key geopolitical nodes, like if you clamp a major artery, the entire body goes into shock.
Yeah, and you induce catastrophic failure across the globe. The assumption is that the system is interconnected to the point of, well, extreme fragility. You can't just isolate one region without collapsing the rest.
Exactly. But then you witness the events of the past few weeks, and suddenly that assumption is being tested in real time, on a global scale.
It really is.
So today, we are examining the profound geopolitical, diplomatic, and economic implications of the escalating use of unilateral military action and economic blockades by the United States.
Specifically, we're looking at the ongoing war with Iran and how those ripple effects are fundamentally reshaping the planet from Latin America to Asia to the Middle East. The central question before us is this: are these aggressive unilateral maneuvers, such as maintaining naval blockades and expanding sanctions, a necessary, albeit painful restructuring that will ultimately enforce a stable, resilient global market order?
Or, conversely, are they driving the planet toward catastrophic economic fragmentation, humanitarian crisis, and the rise of dangerous anti-hegemonic alliances?
Right. And our discussion today is grounded in a synthesis of recent reports from sources spanning the globe, including NBC News, RT, CNBC, Al Jazeera, Bloomberg, and the World Bank.
I will be arguing from a left-leaning perspective that this unilateral aggression is actually fracturing the global economy, sparking devastating humanitarian crises, and systematically isolating Western powers from the rest of the planet.
And I will argue from a right-leaning perspective that decisive, hardline leverage is proving its efficacy right now, demonstrating undeniable market resilience and forcing a necessary reshaping of global institutional compliance.
Well, let's get into it then.
Yeah. To begin, we have to look at the empirical reality of how the markets are responding to the projection of hard power. The argument that strong, unilateral enforcement of geopolitical boundaries destroys economies is fundamentally contradicted by the data.
Is it, though?
It is. The S&P 500 just topped 7,100 for the first time in history, and the Dow soared 1,000 points.
But you can't just rely on...
Let me just finish this thought, because the why is crucial here. This is not a fluke. The global market is explicitly rewarding decisive U.S. action and the restoration of deterrence. Markets don't price in today's broken pipes, they price in tomorrow's monopolies.
Wow, okay.
If the U.S. proves it controls the global spigot and can secure international shipping lanes, investors know a predictable, U.S.-led order will dictate future terms. When you look at the 10-day ceasefire recently brokered between Israel and Lebanon, which, notably includes Hezbollah,
right,
and Iran's subsequent announcement that the Strait of Hormuz is fully open to commercial vessels, you see the mechanism at work. Overwhelming pressure forces adversaries to the negotiating table.
That's one interpretation.
Furthermore, international institutions are actively adapting. We are seeing the IMF and the World Bank resume ties with Venezuela under interim President Delcy Rodriguez. This proves that hard power doesn't just win military conflicts, it actually realigns global financial structures to create a more stable, predictable planetary order.
I come at it from a different way. The short-term stock market boom we are witnessing is a dangerous illusion.
An illusion?
Yes, it's a speculative high that is masking deep systemic planetary damage. When Wall Street cheers, It is fundamentally disconnected from the physical reality of global infrastructure. You mentioned broken pipes, so let's talk about them.
Sure.
The recent Rystad Energy report highlights a staggering $58 billion repair bill for oil and gas facilities across the Middle East. The globe simply lacks the engineering capacity, the raw materials, and the physical supply chain to quickly fix this highly specialized infrastructure.
Well, capital allocation is exactly how...
Hold on, let me get to the human cost, because we share this planet, and the humanitarian toll is just staggering. The UN Development Program estimates that 32 million people across 162 countries could fall into poverty as a direct result of these economic shocks.
Which is terrible, but...
World Central Kitchen founder Jose Andres has issued a dire warning of a multi-year global famine due to the disruption of nitrogen-based fertilizers. By clamping down unilaterally, the U.S. is forcing the rest of the world to build alliances against it for mere survival.
I wouldn't call it mere survival.
We see this vividly with Russia's delivery of 100,000 tons of oil to Cuba in direct defiance of the U.S. blockade. This isn't the creation of a stable order. It is the fracturing of the globe into hostile, isolated blocks.
You bring up a stark contrast between market highs and physical realities, but I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of how global logistics actually recover.
Wait, let me pause you there. I understand the strategic goal you're laying out, but I'm confused about the math here. You mentioned the temporary opening of the Strait of Hormuz as a victory.
Because it is.
And yes, Wall Street reacted enthusiastically because that strait carries 20% of global crude. But how does a headline in New York fix the physical reality on the ground? World Bank President Ajay Banga issued a very stark warning that even if the strait reopens immediately, the logistical damage cannot be reversed overnight.
Well, of course not overnight.
Shipping routes have been fundamentally scrambled. Insurance premiums for vessels entering the region have skyrocketed, and the ripple effects are already hitting critical infrastructure elsewhere.
They are hitting it, but the markets are adjusting.
The International Energy Agency is warning that Europe currently has only 6 weeks of jet fuel left. 6 weeks! And this is exactly what I mean about the why and how. You can't just snap your fingers and refine crude.
No, but
if you disrupt the physical movement of energy for even a month, you create a backlog in refining and distribution that takes seasons to untangle. Ships are out of position. Refineries are running cold. Wall Street is celebrating a headline, but the physical economy of the planet is literally running on fumes.
Think of the global economy right now not as a fragile glass house, but as a forged steel frame. The heat of this geopolitical furnace is actually testing and proving its resilience.
A steel frame?
Yes. Yes, there are localized shortages, and the logistics require recalibration. The jet fuel issue in Europe is a serious logistical bottleneck, absolutely. But the system is responding exactly as it should under pressure. I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how these markets actually clear.
Go ahead.
Look at the immediate mechanics of the oil market. The moment Iran announced the strait was open during this ceasefire, oil prices plunged by 10%.
Which is a relief on paper, sure.
Not just on paper. That instantaneous drop proves that the underlying supply mechanics are eager to normalize. The capital is there, the demand is there, and the moment the U.S. demonstrates that it will not tolerate the closure of international waterways, the market snaps back to efficiency.
I think you're oversimplifying.
The high prices we saw weren't purely a reflection of missing oil. They were a premium on uncertainty. By projecting absolute certainty through the blockade and subsequent military pressure, the uncertainty is removed. The steel frame holds.
It holds only if you ignore the rust accumulating at the joint. A 10% drop in oil prices doesn't magically produce jet fuel in European airports if the physical crude hasn't been refined and shipped.
It incentivizes the refining, though.
It certainly doesn't instantly repair the $58 billion in shattered infrastructure. Your argument treats global trade as a spigot that can be turned off and on at will, without bursting the pipes.
But those pipes aren't bursting. They are just being rerouted. Because economics drives diplomacy. When the U.S. reroutes global trade, it forces nations to acknowledge the leverage the U.S. holds. We are seeing a shift in how countries approach their own security.
Yes, they are shifting by building lifeboats to get away from the U.S. economic engine. These aggressive tactics are severely isolating the United States and creating a unified anti-hegemonic resistance.
I wouldn't call it a resistance.
We are seeing a profound alienation of traditional allies. President Trump recently told a useless NATO to stay away from Hormuz, essentially dismissing decades of transatlantic security cooperation.
Well, he's making a point about burden sharing.
And what is the mechanical result of that? Europe is now actively considering its own maritime coalition, entirely separate from U.S. command. That is a historic fracture in Western diplomacy.
I don't see it as a fracture.
How can you not? Meanwhile, in Latin America, Cuba's president, Diaz-Canel, is publicly vowing defense against a potential U.S. invasion, and more importantly, they are receiving vital energy lifelines from Russia.
Which is nothing new for Cuba.
And over in Asia, China is publicly warning of severe food security risks stemming directly from the U.S.-Israeli war with Iran. You have Europe distancing itself, Latin America fortifying itself with Russian help, and China viewing U.S. actions as a direct threat to its domestic stability. That is the exact recipe for a multipolar conflict, not global compliance.
I view that not as an isolation of the United States, but as a deeply necessary recalibration of global diplomacy.
Like much of NATO, or actively undermine us. The Trump administration's trade over aid push is a highly realistic approach to forcing allies to pay their fair share and take responsibility for their own regional security.
You're framing isolation as a policy win.
If Europe wants to build its own maritime coalition to protect its energy interest in Hormuz, good. That is exactly what they should have been doing for the last 20 years, instead of relying on the American taxpayer to police their supply lines.
But the consequence is a loss of influence.
Is it? As for the alliances between Russia, China, and Cuba, these are relationships of convenience among sanctioned, economically stagnant regimes. They do not pose a systemic alternative to the U.S.-led financial system. I think they're trying to build one right now.
Which brings me to a specific, fundamental question I want to ask you. If we abandon this pressure, aren't we simply subsidizing the hostile actions of nations that explicitly wish to dismantle the current global economic engine?
You are assuming that the current global economic engine can survive the alienation of the rest of the planet.
It survived the Cold War.
When you dismiss the Russia-Cuba-China dynamic as just a relationship of convenience, you ignore the very real physical commodities they control. Russia and China aren't just trading ideology. They are trading energy, technology, and food.
Sure, on a limited scale.
Let's explain how de-dollarization actually works mechanically. When the U.S. applies unilateral blockades and cuts countries out of the SWIFT banking system, those countries don't just stop trading. They literally have to build an alternative financial architecture.
A much weaker one.
Countries are realizing that reliance on the U.S. dollar is a profound national security vulnerability. The recalibration you speak of is actually the U.S. voluntarily relinquishing its diplomatic soft power, relying entirely on the blunt force of military blockades.
Blunt force is often required when the foundational rules of international commerce are violated. The blockade was a direct response to provocations that threatened the global energy supply. You cannot maintain soft power without the credible threat of hard power behind it.
But the application of that hard power is having planetary consequences that far exceed the strategic objectives. Let's look at how this economic maneuvering translates to undeniable human costs on the ground. A lot of people don't realize that an energy blockade is actually a food blockade.
Because of the natural gas disruption.
Exactly. When we talk about the disruption of the Strait of Hormuz, we aren't just talking about gas for cars. We are talking about the synthesis of fertilizers. You need massive amounts of natural gas to synthesize ammonia, which makes nitrogen fertilizer.
Right, the supply chain link.
If the gas can't leave the Gulf, the fertilizer isn't made. Pope Leo XIV recently delivered a highly defiant message in Cameroon, blasting the handful of tyrants spending billions on war. His message resonates because the global south is bearing the brunt of this unilateral strategy.
It is a difficult situation for emerging markets, I agree.
The Caribbean is facing soaring food prices. Haiti is struggling with basic food distributions. If farmers across the developing world miss their planting windows because those fertilizers are trapped behind a blockade, a localized military dispute mathematically becomes a multi-year global famine. A policy resulting in potential mass starvation cannot be justified by any stock market metric,
nor can it be excused as a mere painful restructuring.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. The humanitarian costs are indeed tragic, and no serious strategic thinker dismisses the reality of global agricultural supply chains.
But they are dismissing it.
However, we have to look at the alternative. Capitulating to adversaries like Hezbollah or allowing Iran to dictate the terms of global energy transit out of a fear of economic disruption guarantees endless, protracted proxy wars.
You think a blockade stops proxy wars?
It guarantees perpetual instability that will ultimately cause far more suffering over the decades. The goal of overwhelming pressure is to compress the timeline of conflict, establish dominance, force resolution, and let the markets normalize.
It's not compressing anything, though.
And there is a broad, bipartisan recognition of this strategic necessity within the United States. Just look at the U.S. House of Representatives. They just narrowly rejected a resolution to limit the president's war powers.
Narrowly being the key word.
That vote indicates a domestic consensus that seeing this conflict through to a definitive end, establishing a clear deterrent, is strategically vital for planetary stability. We cannot govern global security by yielding to blackmail over supply chains.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The idea that this strategy is compressing the timeline of the conflict is completely contradicted by the reality of the U.S. military's own logistical strain.
What strain?
If you're listening to this and wondering why the company that built your F-150 is suddenly being asked to build cruise missiles, it's because our burn rate from munitions in this conflict is staggering. The Pentagon is reportedly tapping U.S. car makers like Ford and General Motors to shift toward weapons production.
Which is a brilliant pivot, structurally speaking.
Why?
Because the war against Iran has critically depleted U.S. weapons stockpiles. We are operating at a pace that is forcing the U.S. to consider a World War II-style wartime footing for its industrial base.
That shows commitment. The strategy was working efficiently to compress the conflict. We wouldn't be begging civilian auto manufacturers to build munitions. The strategy is dragging the U.S. into a prolonged war of attrition that it is struggling to supply. And while we deplete our stockpiles, the humanitarian crisis metastasizes and our allies distance themselves.
I would argue that tapping the domestic industrial base is exactly what a resilient superpower does when faced with a structural challenge. Using GM to build missiles isn't just tapping resources, it's like a computer reallocating RAM.
That's a very clinical way to look at a wartime economy.
When the primary system, the Pentagon's dedicated contractors, is overloaded, the U.S. can seamlessly borrow processing power from the civilian sector. Other nations simply don't have that secondary motherboard.
Because they don't fight global wars of attrition.
Activating GM and Ford isn't a sign of weakness. It's a demonstration of massive industrial depth. It signals to adversaries that the United States possesses a capacity that can pivot and scale to meet any prolonged threat.
At an incredible financial cost.
The depletion of stockpiles is a natural consequence of high-intensity operations, but the ability to rapidly replenish them through civilian industry is a uniquely American advantage. It reinforces the deterrent. When adversaries see that the U.S. is willing to bear the financial and industrial cost operating at $2 billion a day, they realize they cannot outlast us. This is how you enforce a stable paradigm.
But at what cost to the planetary community? You say adversaries realize they cannot outlast the U.S., but the reality is that the global poor are the ones who cannot outlast this conflict.
We provide more aid than anyone else.
While the U.S. transitions its auto plants, the global south is running out of food. You cannot isolate the U.S. industrial capacity from the global humanitarian ecosystem. The UN's World Food Program is already struggling to monitor these emerging crises because their funding is being diverted.
That's a temporary reallocation.
When you have a record number of refugees dying at sea, when you have emergency services in Ukraine begging for armored vehicles just to pull people from rubble, the planetary fabric is tearing, and the diplomatic fallout is equally severe.
I don't see the fabric tearing.
By utilizing such heavy-handed tactics, the U.S. is validating the narrative of nations like Russia and China, who argue to the global south that the U.S. is an unpredictable and dangerous hegemon. That is why a country like Cuba feels emboldened to publicly defy the blockade and accept Russian oil. The U.S. isn't enforcing a stable paradigm.
It is acting as a catalyst for a deeply unstable, fragmented world order.
I respectfully disagree with the premise that U.S. actions are the primary catalyst for fragmentation.
The evidence is right there.
The fragmentation was already occurring. The U.S. is finally addressing it. The blockades and the military leverage are direct responses to state-sponsored actors who have spent years attempting to erode international norms. By confronting them directly, the U.S. is drawing a hard line.
A line that cuts off our own allies.
Yes, this transition is incredibly messy. Transitioning from a period of appeasement or soft power ambiguity to a period of hard power enforcement is always going to generate immense friction. But as we summarize our positions today, look at the scoreboard.
The scoreboard?
The geopolitical transition is undeniably turbulent. But the combination of record market highs, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz following the implementation of overwhelming leverage, and shifting institutional alignments, like the IMF stepping back into Venezuela, prove that a firm, unapologetic strategy is effectively working.
If you only look at Wall Street, maybe.
It isn't just a theory anymore. It is actively securing a new, stable global paradigm where consequences for disrupting global order are clear and absolute.
And in my summary, I must point to the profound unsustainability of this approach. You cannot build a stable global paradigm on a foundation of physical and diplomatic ruin.
Ruin is a strong word.
The staggering $58 billion repair costs to Middle Eastern energy infrastructure, the looming threat of a global fertilizer-induced famine that could affect millions, the active alienation of our closest European allies, and the strengthening of physical commodity-backed ties between heavily sanctioned nations like Russia, China, and Cuba. All of this demonstrates that the current path is deeply destructive.
Destructive in the short term, perhaps.
The stock market may be insulated for now because it prices in future monopolies, but the planetary reality is that we are driving toward a humanitarian and economic cliff. The cost of this unilateralism is simply too high for the rest of the world to bear.
Well, the complexity of these events certainly requires us to examine them through multiple lenses. We have to balance high-level financial metrics and domestic industrial capacity against ground-level humanitarian challenges and shifting global alliances. The circulatory system of the global economy is undoubtedly under immense pressure right now.
And the question remains whether these interventions are saving the patient or accelerating the shock. Listeners should continue to monitor these rapidly evolving geopolitical shifts, tracking the data on supply chains, diplomatic alignments, and humanitarian impacts within the reporting from the World Bank, Al Jazeera, Bloomberg, and others.
Absolutely. We leave it to you, our audience, to weigh these complex economic and human factors for yourselves. As we watch this unprecedented test of planetary resilience unfold, ask yourself, when you clamp the artery, does the system forge a stronger path, or does it permanently fracture? Thank you for joining us on The Debate.
That's it for today's Artificially Informed.
Nope. Thanks for spending your time with us.
Yeah.
Stay sharp, stay curious. See you next time.